of evolution. And it works on what we call the logical fallacy of the false dichotomy, that if it's not A, then it must be B by default. If it wasn't Kareem, it must be Anne by default. So, the way that works is that if we criticize evolution, it must be God by default, without the advocates of intelligent design or creationism putting forward any positive evidence for their case. And the bad news for them also is if there was cast iron evidence, famously J.B.S. Haldane said, in order to disprove evolution, if someone was to find a fossilized rabbit in the Precambrian, then that would instantly disprove the theory of evolution. And it would. That's why it's a falsifiable hypothesis. If, however, that fossilized rabbit was discovered and completely disproved evolution, that would be disproving the case against Kareem. It still wouldn't be offering any evidence to back up the case for intelligent design. You need to make a hypothesis, you need to present evidence for it, you can't just criticize the other. And the reason I think this shouldn't be done in classrooms is it's wholly impractical. How can you get a science teacher in a class to say, right, in the first half of the class we're going to teach intelligent design, in which the teacher is going to say, well, for instance, according to our point of view, there's a hole in the theory of evolution because if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? And then after lunch, I'm going to put my evolution hat on and I'm going to tell you why that's a completely ignorant and fatuous argument. I'm going to show you why we can still have monkeys even though we're descended from monkeys. If you're interested in the answer to that, it's simply, for instance, Australians and Americans are from Europe. It's like saying if Australians and Americans are from Europe, why do we still have Europeans? So in that respect, I think it would, just to sum up, essentially I would say that it is utterly impractical and there is no solid case made. It is merely a body of criticism of the theory of evolution. And the theory of evolution ought to be criticised legitimately on scientific terms, but what annoys me about the attempts to put it into classrooms is that its proponents would purport that there are a number of questions that evolution cannot or has not answered, and in reality evolution almost always has. Either its proponents haven't bothered looking up the answers, or they're being a wee bit disingenuous in pretending that these answers don't exist. And if they're going to be disingenuous, I don't want them being disingenuous in my son's class at school. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christopher, especially because you said that we need to make the scientific case for, well, I'm going to argue the scientific case for creationism. And I want to say, yes, we should teach creationism in schools because the existence of a creator is a reasonable conclusion based on the available scientific evidence. I want to take first the origin of the universe. We all know the universe is expanding. Therefore, at one time, it was very compact. And if we extrapolate backwards, it must have been once infinitely compact. And according to the current cosmological theory, it was once a singularity, infinitely dense and infinitely small. And this singularity expanded at inconceivable speeds equivalent to many times the speed of light. The whole thing began as a quantum fluctuation. But I want to ask the question, why did nothing become something? And I also want to ask the question, why does the universe have exactly the right conditions to produce atoms, molecules, stars, planets, and people? The anthropic principle states that the universe has the right conditions because we are only going to be in a universe that has the right conditions, and that's perfectly correct. However, without a creator, it is difficult to see how a universe actually came to exist. The most popular solution is there are an infinite number of universes, the multiverse theory. But furthermore, the anthropic principle, though, requires not just an infinite number of universes, but an infinite number of different universes. So what we need is a mechanism for producing an infinite number of infinitely varying universes so that we actually can exist. And my question is, what is the explanation, what is the mechanism for producing an infinite number of infinitely variable universes? And I would like to argue that the most parsimonious explanation is actually a divine creator. Otherwise, you end up with an infinite regress, which doesn't explain anything. The second question I'd like to ask is about the origin of life. All experiments done to date show that there's no route from chemistry to biology. I want to ask the question is, where do proteins and nucleic acids come from? The very famous Miller-Urey experiment, which is in many of our textbooks, is proposed to be a solution to this problem, but they often fail to point out many of the problems inherent in the answer. The result of these experiments is actually a racemic mixture of chemicals. But the proteins found in living things is not a racemic mixture. It's actually, there's no mechanism known to produce the very specific structure of the protein from a racemic mixture of amino acids. Also, there's no natural mechanism to produce the nucleotides that are needed to create a DNA and RNA. Darwin actually started with the first cell, which is an assumption that might have been reasonable 150 years ago, but today it is a massive assumption given what we know about the complexity of the cell. Which brings me on to what Darwin gave us. I want to ask the third question about the diversity of life. Darwin actually explained to us how natural selection, the survival of the fittest, exists and what it can do. And this theory, and this, well, I actually accept natural selection, a very good theory that explains an awful lot of biology, which together with population genetics, mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, have been combined into the modern synthesis, which explains much of biology. But there's one thing it doesn't explain. It doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. And there are many failures of evolutionary thinking. And just one example of something that was not predicted by the evolutions, which has actually occurred, is when we look at the fossil record. We look at the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of many major phyla in the fossil record, major types of animal in the fossil record. There are no transitional fossils showing how we get from a single common ancestor to all the different phyla that appeared in the Cambrian. There is no explanation as to why all these phyla would appear at the same time, when evolution predicts slow, gradual appearance of different types of animals. And now we have molecular biology, which has really expanded in the last 50 years, revealing to us the fantastic complexity of the cell. Chance and necessity are not a sufficient explanation. It can produce order, but this order that it produces is regular and repetitive, not non-random and specific, like the code you need to manufacture a protein. DNA carries a code. The message requires a messenger. Where does the information come from? And more importantly, we need to remember that genes are only instructions for making the cell, the building blocks, if you like, the cogs and the wheels that make the cell work. There's actually another level of complexity, the so-called non-coding DNA, which controls the genes. And then there's an even higher level of complexity because we find the same switches and the same genes in different types of creatures, and we need an explanation for how that works. Natural selection is not a sufficient explanation for this because it does not produce anything new. It only produces variation on a theme. What is the mechanism to produce new bodies or new features like jaws, fins, limbs and wings? Natural selection can only select what is there. It cannot produce anything new. So what we know about biology is actually consistent with the thesis that there is a creator. Just to conclude, what we know about the cosmos, what we know about life, what we know about biology, revealed to us by science, shows that it was not caused by the laws of physics and chemistry. There are many failures of the evolutionary paradigm to provide a sufficient explanation for the evidence. All that we have learned in the last 50 years is consistent with the thesis that there is a creator. The creator is actually a rational alternative, and we need a paradigm shift to allow this alternative hypothesis to be taught in our schools.
Thank you, Mark. Perfect timing again. Julian.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many strands to this debate, and it's very difficult to sort of untangle them. But I think one of them is following up a bit on what Alex was saying, really. So much of what we hear about the case for intelligent design and for creation, there's quite a lot which I think has been said which is true here. For example, that biology, everything we know about biology is not inconsistent with the existence of a creator. That there are certain problems with the theory of evolution, although actually if you even saw David Attenborough's program the other day, you could see he can explain in 2 or 3 minutes in layman's terms why a lot of these apparently intractable problems are no such thing. So for example, you often hear the example given by ID theorists that the human eye could not have evolved because, you know, it only works if it's all together. Attenborough basically explained why that wasn't true in about 3 minutes. But, you know, there are gaps, there are things we don't understand, the origin of the universe, etc. But the question is, you know, if there are these things we don't understand, and if there are things which are consistent with the existence of a creator, does that mean the existence of a creator is therefore a scientific hypothesis? And it isn't really, which is what I think Alex was saying at the beginning, that he said quite openly that this is not a debate about science, but about worldviews. I think that's true. There is no real science in ideal creationism. So if we're talking about the teaching of science, as it were, the body of scientific knowledge, there just is no room for it in this. And I would argue perhaps later in discussion if someone feels the need to back that up. But does that mean, therefore, that there is no talk about the existence of creators and these competing worldviews in schools? And that, I think, obviously not. I think it's a very good thing to discuss these things. It's just evidently the case that a lot of intelligent people, including people who are top physicists and biologists and so forth, do believe in some kind of God, and often a creator God. Has to be said that there's a lot of evidence that belief in such things tends to diminish with higher education and so forth. The population as a whole, as a survey mentioned earlier, amongst the population as a whole, a lot more people believe in some form of intelligent design or creation than do among the scientific community. But nevertheless, it's possible to be a very intelligent, learned person and still believe in a creator God and so forth. So clearly these are live hypotheses in society, no matter how baffling it may seem to certain atheists and so forth, that these things persist. So we need to talk about them. Not in science as it is currently taught. I kind of think that it's quite good to have a kind of what you might call science studies in some form. I mentioned the Herald column, if you read it, that there's a wonderful course in the A and AS levels, as they have in England and Wales, called Perspectives on Science. It looks at a lot of the issues around the sociology of science, history of science, philosophy of science, relationship between science and religion. I think these are really interesting debates. I think they should be had. I think there's a bit of a limitation at the moment that the only kind of science teaching we get at schools is simply, as it were, the content of science and nothing about the framework and context in which it exists. So I'm all for that. But, one has to be careful not to grant too much here. And this is where the line in the sand, if we are to draw one, because we could agree with so much here, is that there's just there's no way in which we can accept that ID or creationism are scientific hypotheses with any credibility whatsoever. And there are lots of reasons for this. I mean, we could get into a debate about detail, but I think a telling fact is simply if you look at who believes these things or not. On the evolution side, you find that scientists of all kind of persuasion, religious or otherwise, believe in the case for evolution on the basis of evidence and so forth. On the intelligent design side, you find that 99% of people who believe this already have a very strong, not just a strong religious conviction, but actually often a very strong commitment to the sacredness of the Bible and the truth of its teachings. And I think you can see their motivated reasoning, as psychologists call it, absolutely in force. So I mean that's not the case doesn't rest on that, but I think that's just one very, very clear bit of evidence which would be foolish to ignore. So I say, let's talk about these things. Let's talk about competing worldviews. Let's not pretend that it's intellectually disreputable to believe that there's